Hey guys, welcome back. So I have to apologize for the title of today's video. I don't necessarily believe either the 22 TCM or the 5.7 is dumb per se, but I do want to get into the ballistics of the cartridges and how they compare to other more contemporary cartridges and things like that. But the two of them are fairly evenly matched, with a slight advantage going to the 22 TCM in terms of ballistic capabilities. But the guns that use them and things like that are quite different. And in today's video, we want to talk about the 22 TCM, a little bit of the history on it. I'm going to delve into the history of the 5.7. That's pretty well discussed already. But we do want to get into a direct comparison of the 22 TCM to the 5.7 by 28, because the 5.7 by 28 is gaining in popularity and the 22 TCM is kind of like either holding steady or kind of petering out. Not a whole lot of people talk about it or carry it, and there's reasons for that, which we'll touch upon in today's video. So with that being said, our two test guns today will be the 22 TCM. This is from Rock Island Armory, and this is a 1911. This is one of their earlier models that uses pair ordnance type magazines, double stack 17 rounds. Today, I don't believe they make this any longer. They just do the single stack version. And then for our 5.7, we're going to use the Palmetto State Armory Rock. I think it right now as it stands, this is my favorite 5.7 pistol on the market. And we will do some ballistics gel shooting, get you some numbers in terms of velocity. We'll show you what some bullet expansion looks like. And then we're going to talk about the merits of both cartridges, and is one truly superior to the other? And do either truly make sense as a self-defense cartridge? The 22 TCM was the brainchild of a gentleman by the name of Fred Craig, and he worked in the Philippines for Arms Corps in working with their manufacturing that they have over there for their products that they sell here in the United States, like this 1911. And he envisioned the 22 TCM as being an alternative to the 45 ACP. He felt that the cost of 45 ACP was going to become cost prohibitive in the future, and that perhaps they could make something that would chamber in America's handgun, the 1911, that would offer an alternative to the 45 ACP that would be lower cost, lower recoil, and just basically entice potentially those particular customers in, because it would, again, be something that would be thrown into the 1911, popular handgun in the United States, and much lower cost. If you take a look at the cost on the box of the ammunition that I have here, it's $26.99, and that's just full retail. So it is affordable. So the 22 TCM was developed, and a lot of people would say that perhaps the parent case was the 9mm, and that's not true. When you talk about the dimensions of the cases and things like that, they're very similar on purpose. But the 9mm, if you take a look at the edge of the case, it comes to about where the neck starts to taper down on the 22 TCM. The case on the 22 TCM is much longer, so 9mm could not be the parent case. The actual parent case to the 22 TCM is actually the 223 Remington, which I believe makes it the 5th cartridge based on the 223 Remington. But that's where the Wildcat started. And a Wildcat is a cartridge that's not yet in production. It's a cartridge that somebody makes themselves and work it up, and then at some point, if it gets popular enough, it gets, put into production, gets SAMI specs and things like that. So the 223 was the parent case, but as time went on, they had to make some changes to the 223 case. But why did they choose the 223 case? Well, first of all, they needed more brass to work with, but also the 22 TCM operates at about 40,000 PSI. That's pretty high pressure for a handgun cartridge. Keep in mind, that's higher pressure than 10mm, that's higher pressure than 9mm plus P, that's pretty high pressure. And so the 223 case is thicker at the base and offers that additional protection against those higher pressures. So it made a lot of sense. But here's where things had to differ from the 223 Wildcat cases that were used at the beginning to actual production of the 22 TCM. For example, some of the changes. Now, keep in mind also, the goal here was to make the 22 TCM basically work in guns that also chambered the 9mm. So you'd have that flexibility of just going back and forth. In the case of this 1911, it's a simple barrel and spring swap, recoil spring swap. So the 22 TCM, there are some differences from the original 223 case that it was developed from. The rim thickness itself is slightly thicker. The 223 is thinner than a 9mm rim, so they increased the thickness on the production 22 TCM cartridges so that the rim is about the same thickness as the 9mm. Also, if you take a look at the extractor cut, and that's the tapered part of the case as it goes to the rim, if you take a look at the extractor cut, it more closely mirrors that of the 9mm case than it does the 223. And again, that was so that guns designed to shoot 9mm would easily be converted to 22 TCM and you wouldn't run into problems with extraction and things like that. So the final version of the 22 TCM case is its own beast at this point. It's no longer just a cut down 223 case. So when you talk about ballistics, the 22 TCM, an average load like this one uses a 40 grain bullet, and it launches that 40 grain bullet right at around 1970 feet per second. So you're getting pretty close to that 2000 feet per second threshold. And it does offer, very minimal recoil, but it also has some downsides. And we'll talk about pros and cons later on in the video. But keep in mind, we're using a 40 grain bullet going just under 2000 feet per second. Well, there's an argument to be made if you look at some of the specialty bullets that are out there for the 9mm. Now, one of my favorites is an all-copper bullet by Lehigh Defense, and it's called the Extreme Defender. You've seen us test it extensively here on the channel. Its ballistics blow away the 5.7 by 28 and also the 22 TCM. But then you also have things like this Civil Defense, which is a 50 grain bullet doing right around 1900, 2000 feet per second. That just loads into a standard 9mm, so you can get that same velocity. But what I found with some of these specialty 9mm loads like this one, it comes to a screeching halt in gel. It doesn't give you the penetration that you truly need for it to be effective. That's something that the Lehigh, or the Underwood cartridge, I should say, it's a Lehigh bullet, Underwood loading, the Extreme Defender gives you the penetration, gives you the velocity, gives you everything, gives you actually the ability to punch through level 2 body armor and still make it into at least 12 inches of ballistics gel, which is truly impressive. But this isn't about 9mm. This is about 22 TCM. I'm just trying to put it into perspective. We're trying to figure out if the 22 TCM has any practical use whatsoever. And again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the video. One other thing I should mention about the history of the 22 TCM. So we did mention that it was developed by a gentleman by the name of Fred Craig, but another gentleman that is the president of Arms Corps here in the United States, a gentleman by the name of Towson, took an interest in his work with the 22 TCM and said, hey, yeah, let's definitely put this into a product that we can sell in the United States. So originally it was named the 22 Micro Mag, but it evolved, the name evolved into the 22 TCM, which stands for Towson Craig Micro Mag. So that's where we get the 22 TCM from, the name. All right, so now let's talk about the 5.7 by 28 versus the 22 TCM. Why are we having this discussion? Well, there's a lot of folks out there that have made this comparison in the past, and I've watched some videos, but there's some things that were left out in the ballistics comparison. I mean, I've seen people shooting cinder blocks with the two and trying to derive something, conclusive from that. And I wanted to do some ballistics gel testing because that's probably the most practical. And why do I say that? If you watch some of our previous videos, things like the 45 Super, for example, it pushed a bullet at incredible velocity, but what we discovered when we shot it into ballistics gel is that thing literally stopped like 4 to 5 inches of gel. And you would think at the incredible velocity with the bullet weight that it had, it would punch right through 12 inches of gel or more, but it stopped abruptly because the bullet design was poor. The bullet was not designed for those types of velocities. So we wanted to see if that was the case with the 22 TCM. And the 5.7 is well vetted. It's been a military cartridge, been around for decades. And again, I don't want to get into the history of the 5.7 too much, but I think it was a valid comparison to compare the two. I not only wanted to compare the cartridges, but I also want to compare the firearms that are available to fire each of these, because there's some limitations to the 22 TCM. But let's talk about the ballistics of the two cartridges. Here I have, let's take the rock and put it over here. Here I have a 5.7. This is a gold dot. It's a 40 grain bullet, and the 40 grain 5.7 has a velocity that we measured ourselves at 1,828 feet per second, and that gives us a muzzle energy of 297 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. This is an Arms Corps 40 grain load. They call it a hollow point, but it looks more like a soft point to me. But this is one of their standard offerings. There's not a whole lot to choose from. Arms Corps is pretty much the only game in town. So in terms of ammo manufacturers, you really got one choice. And that's true of firearms too, for the most part. But so with this little guy, we had a velocity of 1,971 feet per second, which gave us a muzzle energy of 345 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So we have a 48 foot-pound difference in terms of muzzle energy, and we have about 143 feet per second difference in overall velocity, both of them pushing a 40 grain bullet. So we thought, well, heck, let's put this on ballistics gel or into ballistics gel and see if there's truly a difference in terms of the performance. And so let's quickly take a look at those two tests and see how each of these rounds performed in the clear ballistics gelatin that we use here at the Military Arms Channel. First up will be a 40 grain gold dot, and this will be fired out of a 5-inch barrel of a rock pistol from Palmetto State Armory. And we are using clear ballistics gel. All right, so next up is the 22 TCM. This is a 40 grain bullet. They call this a jacketed hollow point, but it looks more like a soft point. So they call it a hollow point. I'm gonna go with soft point. And here we go into our clear ballistics gelatin. So ballistically speaking, the 22 TCM did have a little bit more punch when the bullet first entered the gel. It had that stretch cavity that was a little bit larger than that of the 5.7, but in overall penetration, the bullets did about the same, right around 16 inches. The 22 TCM bounced back, but that's because of the silicon-based gel that we're using. If you take a look at the expansion of the bullets, and I'm going to pull up my phone here because I have the actual photos here. So if we take a look at the expansion of the 22 TCM bullet, measuring at its widest points, it's 0.291 of an inch. If we go to the 5.7, now it looks more like a clover leaf, but at its widest points, it measures 0.309 of an inch. So we actually got a bit more expansion out of the gold dot 5.7 than we did the 22 TCM. So it penetrated a little bit further only because it stuck in the second block. You know, we got about 14.5 inches with the 22 TCM. We got right at 16 inches with the 5.7. So for me, this is an opinion. Everybody's opinion changes, but penetration is king when you're talking about handgun cartridges. You want to be between 12 to 18 inches of penetration for optimal performance. And this is something the FBI came up with when trying to determine what handgun cartridges are effective versus other cartridges. So that's something that I kind of go by. It's a guideline. Now, there's a number of different things that you need to take into consideration when you're looking at a cartridge for self-defense. It's not all about velocity. It's not all about bullet weight. Bullet design, bullet weight, bullet velocity, surface area. All sorts of things come into play in terms of what makes a handgun cartridge or a cartridge in general more effective than another cartridge. But taking a look at the two, the 5.7 and the 22 TCM, they're pretty evenly matched. I would say that in terms of ballistic performance, one isn't vastly superior to the other. Slight edge going to the 22 TCM. But that brings us to the pros and cons, because this is where the 22 TCM, in my opinion, falls way behind the 5.7. So let's talk about the 22 TCM's pros. Okay, these are the positives of the cartridge. So the first one would be light recoil. When you shoot one of these, the recoil on it almost feels toyish. It's almost like shooting a 22 Magnum. The gun just doesn't move. It's actually quite satisfying. It's a very pleasant gun to shoot. So definitely a pro. Now, if you can find one of these earlier guns that uses the para-ordnance magazines, you can get 17 rounds into them, so it does have that capacity as well. Now, the cost on the 22 TCM, the ammunition, is very affordable. So that is a definite pro to the 22 TCM, 50 rounds being right at $25. That's pretty cost effective in the grand scheme of things. Then you do have the fact that it works in America's handgun, the 1911. 1911 is just a popular handgun all the way around. Some people hate it, but the vast majority of Americans understand that John Browning was a genius. This gun served 75 plus years in the U.S. military. It is an outstanding handgun, right? So 1911, good choice for a pistol to chamber it in. And so good capacity, good choice, 1911 in terms of a handgun to fire it out of, low cost and low recoil. Those are the pros. the cons to the 22 TCM. This is where we get into why I personally would not use it as a defensive carry gun. Reliability. So the reliability of this particular handgun, well, just let me demonstrate. 1911s are handguns that don't lend themselves well to just being slapped together after parts coming off a CNC machine. They truly need hand fitting for them to be 100% reliable and to work as designed. This is a single round. This particular handgun has the same malfunction over and over again. I've put one round into the magazine. I'm going to keep my hand well away from the slide stop. I'm just going to pull the slide to the rear. Oh my gosh, it actually picked it up. Hold on. Because that's not normal. All right, keep my hand away from the slide stop, pull it to the rear, and see how it locked open. That's what it does every time I fire it. I get to that last round of the magazine, it locks open. If you take a look at what's happening, it's just not properly fit. The slide stop is being engaged by the follower on the magazine, even though it has a round in the magazine, and it's ever so slightly just catching that notch. Every single time when you fire it. Now, can I fix that by a little bit of hand fitting? Absolutely, but that just speaks to the lack of overall quality from your average 1911 offered by Armscore. Not to pick on Armscore too much, I love what they do, but their 1911 quality just isn't up there with something like a Dan Wesson or something like that, like a Springfield Operator or something in that price range. It just isn't. So that's definitely a con, reliability. You have a single source for firearms and ammunition for the 22 TCM. Now, there is a rifle out there I've never been able to get my hands on that Armscore offers. It's a bolt-action rifle. And it increases the performance of the 22 Micro Mag considerably, or the TCM. It gets that bullet advertised up to about 2,800 feet per second out of a rifle using like a 20-inch barrel. That's pretty impressive for a handgun cartridge. But don't have one of those here. So you have a single source of ammunition, which is Armscore. You have a single source of handguns, and that is Armscore and a 1911. And right now it's a single stack because, to my knowledge, they're no longer making the double stack handguns. And to me, that is a big problem, right? If I wanted to use the 22 TCM for something other than just range work, I want a handgun I can absolutely rely on. And this particular copy of the Armscore 1911 just isn't reliable enough for my use. It's uncommon. You're not going to walk into a gun store and just find 22 TCM sitting on the shelves generally. I've been into Cabela's and places, big box stores that carry everything imaginable, and I've almost never seen 22 TCM sitting on the shelves. But you can buy it online, so that's not a major con, but it is a con. You have to order it online and have it shipped to you. And in some states, that's becoming a problem because of stupid gun laws. And the other thing that I would just mention, it's not something that I would be overly concerned with in terms of self-defense and things like that, but it has significant concussion, blast, and a fireball. I mean, when you shoot it, even though it has no recoil, it is a boom. It's a thunderous boom. It really does make you think you're shooting something much bigger than a 22 TCM. So those would be the cons. So the 5.7 has none of those cons. Let's talk about that for a moment. The 5.7 is on this upward trajectory. For decades, when the 5.7 first came out, FN was a sole source of ammunition. FN was a sole source of firearms, much like is the current state of things for the 22 TCM. But today, in 2023, Smith & Wesson just launched their new 5.7 handgun we're waiting to get our hands on. You have the Rock from Palmetto State Armory, very affordable 5.7 handgun. This is one of my favorites. The Ruger, the original FN. All sorts of companies are making guns for them. CMG has a firearm that chambers it. You have not just handguns, but Panzer Arms is back to building the AR-5.7 uppers. This is an SBR, but you have all sorts of options for the 5.7, and that's just simply not the case with the 22 TCM. It's very much locked into one manufacturer and minimal offerings. So the 5.7 now has AAC, which is Palmetto State Armory, starting to spin up production of the ammunition. You have Federal making the ammunition. You have defensive loads like the gold dots that we've showed you here in today's video. And you just have regular ball ammo out there that's used for affordable practice, but it's still not as affordable as 22 TCM, generally speaking. So you don't have a single source of ammo, you don't have a single source of firearms for the 5.7. When you talk about uncommon, 5.7, Pretty much any gun store worth its salt has 5.7 in stock, assuming the ammunition is available, but it's also widely available online. And again, more companies are making ammunition now. AAC from PSA starting to spin that up, and they promise to bring the cost of the ammunition down to well below $1 per round. So that's going to start to cut into the cost of the 22 TCM, where it has that slight advantage over the 5.7. And then when you talk about significant blast and all that stuff, the 5.7, it's got a little pep in its step, but if you shoot the 5.7 next to the 22 TCM, the 22 TCM definitely, in my opinion, has more blast and concussion and fireball and all that stuff. Not a major concern, but I just wanted to point out that when it comes to the cons of the 22 TCM, the 5.7, in my opinion, doesn't share any of those cons. It just seems like this thing's skyrocketing in popularity as of late, along with the 10 millimeter, which is interesting to see, because I do think the 5.7 has its uses. So my opinion, what do I think of the 22 TCM? It's a toy. It'll always be a toy. Yes, I can put the 9 millimeter barrel in it and take this handgun out and shoot 9 millimeter, but then again, I can buy any number of 9 millimeters of higher quality than Arms Corp products and carry a 9 millimeter. So having that ability to swap between 22 TCM and 9 millimeter has marginal value to me. I generally buy a gun in a cartridge that I want to use. Rarely do I buy a gun that's multi-cartridge capable and actually swap between cartridges. So in my opinion, that right there makes it relegated to being, a novelty, a range toy, things like that, especially given the fact that my only 22 TCM firearm isn't even 100% reliable. To be fair, it's just locking open on that last round that's in the magazine, something I can and will fix at some point when I get off my rear end. But other than that, this gun has pretty much worked okay for me. The 5.7, on the other hand, is a cartridge that has true application, right? The handguns that are available out there, if you go back in time and watch one of our gauntlet tests where we took the 5.7, FN 5.7, and threw it through the gauntlet, that thing didn't want to quit running. Very reliable handgun. Had very good luck with the Ruger, had really good luck with the Rock from PSA. And again, this is my favorite 5.7 currently on the market right now, just because of ergonomics, how it shoots and things like that. Suppresses really well. So you definitely have better choices if you want a defensive gun in a cartridge that launches a 40 grain bullet with the 5.7 by 28. Better guns, more choices of ammunition. Speaking of ammunition, this is what we tested today, was just average gold dot. This is stuff you can pretty much pick up at any gun store that carries defensive ammo. But if you get online, there are other 5.7 cartridges loaded by companies like Elite Ammunition that give you even more performance out of the 5.7. Now, it won't be a 40 grain bullet. You're going to get into the 27, 28 grain bullets, but they're going at higher velocities with some really interesting bullet designs that give you some really interesting performance metrics that the 22 TCM doesn't have. Now, we didn't go that far down the rabbit hole in today's video. I just wanted to point out that there were specialty cartridges out there for the 5.7 that up its game in terms of what's available, like the gold dot ammunition that's out there. When it comes to a carry cartridge, I'm far more interested in cartridges like the 10 millimeter. 9 millimeter is impossible to beat. It's just probably one of the best. But if you're looking for a bottleneck hot rod, you always have the option of the 357 SIG, which has incredible ballistics. If you use a defensive load in the 357 SIG, you can get about 1,400 feet per second out of a 125 grain bullet, which is going to give you 544 foot-pounds of energy. If you're a foot-pounds of muzzle energy chaser, I'm not. I'm more into bullet performance and gel. So velocity is just one piece of that. 10 millimeter, heavy bullet at really good velocities, but it's a little bit stout in the recoil department. And then 9 millimeter, everybody makes a 9 millimeter handgun. Tons of choices for ammunition. And unfortunately, 357 SIG is kind of petering out. So in the end, the 5.7, if I was going to carry one of these two for a defensive gun, no doubt would I go with the 5.7. The 5.7 is the better of the two cartridges, just simply because of the different types of guns that are available, different types of ammunition. And the 22 TCM, neat toy. It's something if you want to introduce somebody to center fire, you have a new shooter or something like that. Make sure they have good hearing protection on because of the blast, but shooting it is extremely pleasant. But then again, so is shooting a 22 long rifle, which is even more cost effective and even better for introducing new shooters to the sport. So really, I don't see anything truly redeeming about the 22 TCM other than the novelty of it. And that is why I titled this video Dumb and Dumber. I don't really think the 5.7's dumb. I won't say the 22 TCM is dumb, but in my mind, it really serves no practical purpose. I look forward to your comments down below, guys. Please understand, these are just my opinions. I'm sure there's people out there that absolutely love 22 TCM, carry it every single day for self-defense, and you do you. I'm not trying to dissuade you from doing that. If you'd like to support us here at the Military Arms Channel so we can continue to bring you content like this, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. There is a link in the video description below. Also, please follow us over on Twitter. We post a whole bunch of stuff over there every day on Twitter, including, specials and things like that. So please check us out over on Twitter. Again, there's a link in the video description below. Right here on YouTube, you got the little tip button underneath the video player you're watching right now. You can click that tip button, throw us a few bucks. That helps support us on our mission to bring you content like this. Or you can just join us for a monthly fee, and there's a join button underneath the video player you're watching right now as well. With all that being said, please swing by and check out Copper Custom. Thank you for 15 years of support, and we will talk to you guys soon.